I really appreciate your being here. And I wanted to thank Christina for just a fabulously right-on presentation. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think it'll be a good one. So, as was said, I've been working on mass incarceration issues, sentencing issues, pretty much since I was in graduate school. My dissertation was on justice and mercy, and I've always had this frustration with the rhetoric of retribution, and so that was kind of my end to this whole conversation. And I've evolved since I started, but certainly that passion for trying to rethink what we do in punishment is really important to me. So, start out with the classic slide. This is from the Sentencing Project, which is a great place to get great information about our current sentencing process. But this shows you to what extent the United States outpaces every other country in the world when it comes to incarcerating people. We incarcerate 655 people out of every 100,000. It used to be 720, but nonetheless, we are still the most unfree country in the world. And most of those folks, as Christina said, are black. And I want, we've had those statistics, but that's the graph, right? And here's, I want a little bit of a shout out to Marie Gottschalk, who in 2006 really said, hey, the way that we have to solve mass incarceration is by a new civil rights movement. And she is, to my knowledge, is the first one who really named that. And I applaud her because I think she was before her time there. How did this happen? How did we get to a place of mass incarceration? Well, we heard a lot about this. So Christina's already talked about the differential sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, the differential use of the criminal system for drug involvement between black and white people, the differential rates of stops and searches and arrests, especially for minor offenses like traffic tickets, the differential rate of requests for police intervention against blacks versus against whites, like who calls the police for what, and on who. Differential rates of informal sanctions, especially at school, who gets suspended, who gets arrested in school. Differential rates of folks who are let out on their own recognizance versus who has to post bail, obviously who then gets incarcerated before they're convicted. Differential rates of application of mandatory penalties. There's a story in Connecticut to tell about this because of course it's a crime to deal in drugs, but then there's a mandatory sentence if you deal in drugs close to a school. Now, all of New Haven is a school zone, which means that if you're arrested in New Haven, you are definitely going to get this extra bump on your sentence for being close to a school. If you're arrested in Brantford or some of these suburban towns in Connecticut, you're not going to be close to a school, so you're not going to get that automatic extra sentence. So that means that folks who live in New Haven, i.e. black folks, are getting higher sentences than folks who live in the suburbs, i.e. white folks. So that's differential rates of application of three strikes laws. I mean, then you've got cascade effects, because who has a record and who doesn't, right, after all of these other things. And of course, structural disadvantages based on 200 plus years of housing and job discrimination, social stigma, disrespect, and fear that we heard about. So that's why we have this statistic. And what are we going to do about it? Well, if the ACLU folks were here today, if the NAACP folks were here today, if the Southern Poverty Law Center folks were here today, they would tell you, here's what we're doing. First of all, we have to increase diversion programs. We have to divert people from going to prison to doing other kinds of social services, drug treatment, job programming, training, housing help, and of course using school discipline inside the school rather than getting people arrested. We want to have fairer and fewer drug laws. We want to start treating addiction as a disease. We want to raise the age at which people get incarcerated as adult criminals. And so, for example, I teach at York Prison. One of my former students was 14 years old and involved in a felony murder, which means that you get a murder charge even if you're not the shooter. Okay. And she ended up with a 50-year sentence at 14 years old. So raising the age at which someone gets treated as an adult versus a juvenile. Bail reform, we've talked about. Trying to make sure that we're releasing people who are just poor and can't afford bail. And we're only keeping people pre-trial if they're really dangerous, instead of letting the dangerous folks buy their way out and letting the poor people stay in. Alternatives to incarceration, well, we're going to talk about that, because I think that there are folks who are really, really dangerous. What are we going to do about that? And how are we going to make sure that this isn't a race-based system? More drug treatment, reentry programming, education and job training for folks getting out, for folks before they come in to the process. And then, of course, limiting all of those collateral consequences of a conviction, making sure that you're not barred from certain jobs, making sure that you get to vote, even while you're inside, even while you're suffering from your sentence of imprisonment. And so those are the things that these groups are doing, and they're doing a great job at it, and it's having some improvement. So if you look at the timeline for how many people we have incarcerated in the United States, you'll notice a big, big, big jump in the 1980s with the very, very serious drug law. Kind of the 3 strikes laws came in, the mandatory minimums came in, the tough on crime rhetoric started. You have this huge upswing in incarceration. And then you see it tailing off a little bit over the last few years. And part of that tailing off is some of the, I think, criminal justice reform that we've seen. But we still have a whole lot of people incarcerated. I want to talk about the deeper causes. We've already had Christina talk to us about the very deepest cause, which is racism. But there's also this problem, in my view. So my sort of way in again was thinking about retributivism. And is there a different way that we can think about dealing with criminal behavior? Can we do something different than just say, you have committed a crime, therefore you need a consequence, therefore that consequence has to hurt, and it has to hurt you, and then you have to pay your debt, right? So that's the retributivist model. Is there a different way to conceptualize what we do in punishment, what we do in after somebody commits a serious crime? And I think a lot of it, you can have the whole philosophy if you want, but I won't do that to you today. But I've moved from, I've had this sort of long 40-year conversation with Kant, who basically says in order to be a full person, you have to take personal responsibility for your actions. And you have to universalize your principles, and if you don't, then you deserve punishment. And I've had a fight with them for 40 years. It's been a long time. And I've moved toward sort of philosophical forebears that are more like Levinas, who emphasize the fact that we are all connected to each other, that we are not isolated little people, and that crime is not just irrationality or harm, but it's also a breaking of social bonds. And so then what do you do for punishment? It's not about hurting the person that did the crime so much as trying to reestablish those broken social bonds. So obviously I've moved toward a restorative justice model of what we do about crime. Compassion and atonement should be the model for what we do. I think that it has several stages. I think it's important for someone who has hurt someone else to reflect and confront that crime, to think about what the victim has suffered because of what they've done. I think apologies has an important role to play here as an acknowledgement that I see what I did to you and I'm sorry. And then I think that there's a place for this. What we do in real life is we say, okay, what can I do to make it up to you? What can I do to make it up to you? And so there has to be this sort of moment of meaningful service. And it can't just be picking up garbage by the side of the road. It has to be meaningful. And finally, I think that there's also this place for what do we do with folks who are committing these crimes because they've suffered from crimes themselves. Most of the people who are locked up right now are victims of crime. Almost everybody in the prisons in Connecticut, in the male prisons at least, has been shot. That was one of the findings that kind of surprised folks when they went in and started interviewing people. Like, they've all been shot. They're all victims of crime. They've all suffered trauma. So what do you do about someone who is committing a crime because they've had crimes committed against them? And then I think we have to talk about, okay, well, what tools can we give folks to recover from that trauma, to get the education that they never got in the first place, which is why I got involved in prison education, to get the training, the job training, to get the treatment. So there has to be that piece too. And then, of course, once they come back in, there has to be forgiveness and welcome from the community. So this is what it ought to look like, right? It ought to look like the hug in the courtroom is like a great thing. That should be what we're after. We're after this kind of forgiveness. But, of course, the most famous hug in the courtroom lately has been this one. So what do we do when it's only women or people of color who are doing the forgiving? And is restorative justice even possible in a context of racial inequality? So for those of you that may not know what's happening here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these images and know what this is all about. Okay. So for those of you that aren't, Amber Geiger is a white police officer. She was texting her boyfriend and flirting with her boyfriend, and after a shift she comes home, she opens her apartment door, she walks in, there's a black man sitting on her couch. She freaks out, she pulls a gun and she shoots him dead. Only later to find out that she wasn't in her own apartment, she was in his apartment. Okay. So why did she react with that kind of immediate fear? Why? So then she goes to court. She gets a sentence of 5 years. She gets a hug from the judge. The victim's brother forgives her, gives her a hug in the courtroom. And we're outraged because why is it that it's always black people that are forgiving people? And why isn't she getting the kind of sentence that black men get when they do stuff like this, right? Why is she getting this benefit when a black man who shoots a police dog gets 20 years? So this raises the real problem with trying to change the criminal justice system, I think. And that is, are we leveling up or are we leveling down? We can always treat white people more harshly. We can level up, if you will. Or we can try to treat black people less harshly. We can level down. So that's always the issue with equality. And so we have right now the same debate that we had 20 years ago about victims' rights, right? And I used to go to these conferences and you would hear these parents who had lost their children to violence saying, well, my offender got 10 years. Well, my offender got 20 years. Well, my kid's as good as your kid. Why didn't my offender get 20 years, right? And so I don't want us to, this is the danger, it's like, I don't want us to fall into that kind of debate about how much punishment equates to whose value in the community. And this is one of the reasons that we even had the 1984 federal sentencing guidelines, because the ACLU and the NAACP supported this. They wanted mandatory sentencing. They wanted to level up. They wanted to see white-collar offenders getting the same sentence that black offenders were getting. They wanted to level up, and they thought that if we made sentencing mandatory, that's what would happen. We would get more equality in the criminal justice system. That's not what happened. There's also this sort of dynamic, which James Foreman talks about, that in the era of the 80s, folks who were black leaders we're calling for mandatory penalties for the very same reason. We want white people to get the same sentences black people are getting, okay? And we don't want to come before you and say to you that our kids can't do it, our kids can't be personally responsible, our kids need extra help. We don't want to say that. We don't want to beg for mercy. We want to be just as cool and responsible as white kids. We just want you to treat white people the same. And so they were supporting these mandatory penalties at the time. I don't think they understood, all of the other things that went on. It wasn't just the sentencing, it was the policing, it was the bail, it was all the sort of other pieces that were happening. But that was a really powerful argument. I don't want to beg for forgiveness. That's demoralizing. That's, weak. I want to be strong and responsible, and I want to say that if you just treat everybody the same, then great, that's all we need. Well, it didn't work out that way, in part because who calls the police on who, and who's afraid of who, right? And this is what we know to be true now, right? We know that if you are richer, older, and whiter, you are more likely to trust the police, you're more likely to call the police, you're more likely to report a crime. And whose crimes are you going to report? Right? Who is feared? Well, who is feared? It's the black people that are feared. How do we change that narrative? And so here's where I think, the kinds of things that Christina is doing is awesome. I think that we have long had a false history of the Civil War. We've had a false history of the period after the Civil War. And we have to retell that history to ourselves. I think that's what's been happening with the, this is another example of the difference in the way that we treat people. We've got to, if we're going to say we're going to have a restorative justice system, then it can't be the black people that ask for mercy first. It's got to be the white people that say they're sorry and that do some reparation for what we've done over all this time. So I think that part of this dialogue has to start with, okay, who's guilty first of all, and who needs to do this repair in order to get us back to a place, and also how do we retell our history in a way that is honest about what happened after the Civil War, is honest about convict leasing, is honest about Jim Crow, is honest about all of these things. And we haven't been telling that history. That wasn't the history I learned in 7th grade. So we have efforts to do that now, and I think that's super important. We have Black Lives Matter making the case. We have the new African American History Museum in DC. We have the Lynching Museum in Montgomery. We have 13th. We have the new Jim Crow. We have a lot more efforts to try to tell the story and to narrate those stories and to show that the people who are incarcerating are our children, not black children, our children, our people. So building those compassion, building that public perception, and getting rid of the bias and trying to change the narrative. The other thing we have to do, this is the one thing. It's like you can't, if you're going to not live next to someone, then you're always going to other them. And until we change housing, we're always going to other the people that are not living with us. So, we've actually done quite a bit in the job setting to create more equality. We've actually done some stuff to create equality in the educational setting, not as much as we should, but it's housing. Housing has been the thing that's been the most intransigent problem, and you can see it in every place in New Haven, you can see it in every place in Connecticut. It's just completely dramatic, and so how do we address that problem? And I think that's got to come first so that we can have more compassion for each other, so we can see each other as neighbors and as our children rather than their children. Now, of course, this creates cause for pessimism because we've been doing this for a gazillion years, right? It's all, it's like we had this debate. We had this debate in the 60s, we had this debate in the 80s, we had this debate now. It's like, why is this moment in time any different than any other moment for trying to address these issues? Well, here's what gives me hope. In 1994, 81% of Americans supported three strikes legislation, life imprisonment for a third felony. Okay. That's when I started teaching. And now, 87% of people express disapproval of mandatory minimum sentences. 75% believe the criminal justice system needs reform. I never imagined that would happen in my lifetime. I mean, that's a huge turnaround. Now, it doesn't necessarily get to the core issues, but that's a huge turnaround in public perception. So if we can change public perception that dramatically, just in the time that I've been teaching, then we have hope.